If you search Google for the father of epidemiology, you'll find John Snow, famous for using a mapping strategy to identify the Broad Street water pump as the source of the 1854 London cholera outbreak. But 8 years prior, Peter Ludvig Panum of Denmark, with the assistance from August Manicus and a migrating pod of pilot whales, learned several important properties of measles infections and epidemics that would protect populations in future years. It was 1864 and the Faroe Islands were experiencing their first contact with measles in 65 years. The Faroe Islands rise jaggedly out of the North Atlantic and in 1864 contained a population of about 7,000 or so. The population was really a series of subpopulations spread across the 18 islands. Movement between the islands was so rare that it was often noted in people's calendars. Not only was travel between the islands rare, but even movement from village to village on a given island was uncommon due to the island's extraordinarily rough terrain. The insular nature of this subpopulation and good record keeping would make it the perfect location to study the dynamics of measles. In response to the epidemic on its protectorate, Denmark sent 2 physician candidates, not even fully fledged physicians, to study the outbreak and attempt to save a few lives if possible. Peter Panum and August Manicus began their investigations in late June and quickly learned that 3 months earlier, a man named Christian Holm returned to the Faroes at Torhaven after visiting a friend in Copenhagen. On his return, Holm was not feeling well. He had a headache, fever, and joint pain. What no one knew was that he was experiencing the prodrome of measles. Now, he was nursed by 2 of his neighbors, who in turn developed measles about 2 weeks later. The key fact that Panum picked up on was that there was a delay between when people were getting exposed to measles and when they first developed symptoms. Measles had an incubation period. This incubation period had been considered by physicians prior to Panum's investigations, but it was not crystal clear, and the length of the putative incubation period had rough estimates between 4 days to weeks. The lack of clarity about this incubation period was really due to a fourfold problem. 1, in urban populations in mainland Europe, United States, and other areas, measles was endemic. That is, it occurred regularly. 2, it is infectious even before it's symptomatic. 3, it is highly infectious. And if that wasn't enough, 4, some people still believe that disease in general was caused by bad air and or immoral behavior. All of these made the source of an infection or epidemic difficult to parse from the background population. The isolation of the Faroe Islanders, not only from outsiders, but even from each other, allowed the signal to stand out from the low background noise. And then there were the pilot whales, or the grind, as the Faroe Islanders would call them. Meat from these animals was and still is highly prized. It can be eaten raw, wind-dried, or cooked. The pilot whales are a major essential source of calories. For the Faroese, there appears to be no greater cause for celebration than the pilot whale migration. For the harvest, or grindhaul, Islanders from otherwise isolated villages come together. So on June 4th, 1846, 10 men from the village of Tornevig joined fishermen from Vestmanhaven. At that time, Tornevig had not experienced any cases of measles, but Vestmanhaven had. And, as would have it, some of the fishermen had measles, which they passed on to the sailors from Tornevig. 14 days after the grindhaul and back at their own village, the Tornevig sailors developed measles. All 10 of them. 14 days after that, those sailors' contacts had measles as well. These findings were reinforced by those of August Manicus, who was studying the epidemic on the southern end of the archipelago. There he found a family that lived an exquisitely solitary life. Indeed, they saw their clergyman only once a year, and he had to be hauled up a cliff by rope just to get to their homestead. Only once during the epidemic did the family descend from its perch to buy supplies in the closest town. They returned home the same day, but 14 days later, the whole family was suffering from the measles. The data was solid. Panum and Manicus had not only quashed any remaining thought that the measles was caused by bad air, but they determined the incubation period as well. Panum had such confidence in the 14-day incubation period that when interviewing contacts and learning of when they were exposed, he'd advance 14 days on the calendar and say, "You'll get sick on this day." He was really seen as a soothsayer by the Faroese. But Panum also observed that people only could be infected if they were exposed to a measles patient a few days before or after the patient developed the characteristic rash. Previously, some physicians thought that the rash itself, as it dried up and was sloughed off the skin, was the source of the infection. But Panum corrected this myth and now was able to define the period of time that a patient or contact should be isolated or quarantined to 4 or so days before and after the rash. This information likely saved quite a few lives when measles next returned to the Faroes in 1875. If that wasn't all, Panum noticed in 1846 that contacts 65 years and older rarely contracted measles. Measles had not occurred on the Faroes since 1771, 65 years before. Panum's conclusion? Prior infections with measles conferred long-term, if not lifelong, immunity. So Google may list John Snow as the father of epidemiology, but Dr. Snow's actions and his map might have been inspired by Panum's paper and Panum's map on the movement of measles in the Faroe Islands. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe.